When I bought Marilyn Monroe's abandoned house, I just wanted silence. After my husband died, I couldn't bear to walk through the same rooms where he wasn't anymore. And that forgotten house, which everyone avoided, seemed like the only place where I could disappear without disappearing from myself. But on the first night there, I realized something didn't make sense. Doors locked from the inside, old documents left in a hurry, an entire room that seemed never to have been touched. And there was a specific spot on the floor, a hollow sound, deep, as if it were hiding something someone had tried to bury forever. On the third day, when the floor gave way beneath my feet, I discovered that the true story of that house had never been told. And now I ask you, what would you do if the house you bought to escape pain held a secret that could destroy an entire piece of American history? When I signed the papers, my hand was trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. I was a widow, trying to survive my own echo, trying to exist in a world that kept moving forward, while I remained frozen in the moment my husband's heart stopped beating. The realtor handed me the keys too quickly, almost rushing through the final pleasantries, as if she wanted to be rid of both me and the house at the same time. I noticed the relief in her eyes when I told her I didn't need her to walk through the property with me. She'd said something vague about the house having a complicated history and left it at that. As I crossed the threshold for the first time as the owner, I felt something strange. It wasn't cold and it wasn't warm. It was like walking through someone's memory, like stepping into a moment that had been preserved in amber, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it. The dust seemed to have settled there for decades, undisturbed, coating every surface with a grey film that muffled sound and softened edges. But as I moved through the front room, I noticed something that made me pause. Some marks on the hardwood floor were recent, drag marks, scuff marks, footprints that had been hastily erased but not quite completely. Someone had been here. Recently, I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. A narrow hallway stretched before me, lined with doors on both sides. I tried each one as I passed. Bedroom, bathroom, storage closet, another bedroom. All of them opened easily, their hinges creaking from disuse but offering no resistance, except one. The last door on the left was closed, and when I tried the handle, it didn't budge. Not because it was locked from my side, but because it was locked from the inside. I could see the old-fashioned bolt mechanism through the gap between the door and the frame. It had been secured from within the room itself. How does a door get locked from the inside of an empty house? I spent hours that first day just walking through the rooms, trying to imagine her here. Marilyn Monroe, the icon, the legend, the woman who'd become more myth than human in the decades since her death. I pictured her writing at the small desk by the window, rehearsing lines in front of the mirror, laughing with friends in the kitchen. But I also imagined her crying, alone, in rooms just like these. Near the fireplace, I found scattered papers, official-looking documents with ornate letterheads and dense legal text. Some had been partially burned, their edges blackened and curled, as if someone had started to destroy them and then been interrupted, or changed their mind or run out of time. I gathered them carefully, setting them aside to examine later. My mind was already cataloguing mysteries, filing away questions I didn't yet know how to answer. In the kitchen, a 1962 calendar still hung on the wall, yellowed and brittle. The last week of that year had been crossed out with heavy black ink, each day marked with an X. Someone had been counting down to something or dreading something's arrival. But it was in the main bedroom that I felt it most strongly. That sense of wrongness, of secrets pressed into the very structure of the house. I was walking slowly across the floor when I heard it, a hollow sound beneath my feet. Not the solid thunk of hardwood over foundation, but something deeper, emptier. Like there was space below where there shouldn't be any. I stopped and pressed my foot down again, harder this time. The sound was unmistakable, a low, resonant thud that spoke of hidden chambers and deliberate construction. Someone had built something beneath this room, something they'd wanted to conceal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in a sleeping bag in the living room, too exhausted to care about comfort, listening to the house settle around me. Old houses make noise, I knew that. Boards contracting in the cooling air, pipes adjusting, foundations shifting microscopically. But around 2 in the morning I heard footsteps in the hallway, clear, deliberate, human. I sat up, my heart hammering, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The house was supposed to be empty. I had no neighbors close enough to accidentally wander in. The doors were locked. I was alone. Except I wasn't. The footsteps moved slowly down the hallway, paused outside my door, then continued past. They faded into silence, but the certainty remained. This house was breathing on its own, holding memories and secrets that refused to stay buried, and I had just bought my way into whatever story it had been trying to tell for the last 60 years. I spent the entire next morning obsessively testing the floor. I'd brought a broomstick from the closet and methodically worked my way across the bedroom, tapping every few inches, listening for that distinctive hollow sound that didn't belong. Most of the floor returned a solid, dull thunk, but in one specific area, about 3 feet from the foot of the bed, the sound changed. It was deeper, more resonant, like knocking on a drum rather than solid ground. I got down on my hands and knees, examining the floorboards more closely. They looked identical to all the others. Same wood, same wear patterns, same aged finish. But when I pressed down with both hands, applying my full weight, I felt something that made my breath catch. The floor gave way, just slightly, maybe half an inch, but enough to confirm that something beneath it wasn't solid foundation. My heart was racing now. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlight I'd brought with me, then returned to lie flat on the bedroom floor, pressing my face close to the boards. I could see gaps between them, narrow spaces where light and air could pass through. I shone the flashlight into one of these gaps and moved it slowly, trying to see what lay beneath. The beam caught something metallic, something that gleamed dully in the darkness below. It looked like a structure of some kind, deliberate and manufactured, not natural. This wasn't a crawl space. This wasn't a simple foundation gap. This was something that had been built intentionally, something designed to be hidden beneath the ordinary surface of the room. I spent the next hour examining the floorboards, looking for any way to access what was below. Finally, I found it. A section where the boards weren't nailed down like the others. They'd been cut and fitted to lift away, but someone had sealed them so carefully that you'd never notice unless you were specifically looking. Using a butter knife from the kitchen, I worked at the edges until I could get my fingers underneath. The boards lifted with surprising ease, revealing what they'd been concealing. A metal door, industrial-looking, completely out of place, in a 1960s residential home. It looked like something you'd find in a bank vault or a military facility, not beneath the bedroom floor of a Hollywood actress's house. The metal was old, but well-preserved, and it was secured with heavy bolts, the kind that required specialized tools to remove. But what made my skin crawl was the evidence around the edges of the metal door. There were scratch marks, gouge marks, signs that someone had tried to open this before. Recently, judging by the freshness of some of the marks, someone had been here, had found this door, and had tried desperately to get it open. Had they succeeded? Was that what the footsteps had been about? I needed tools, proper equipment. I stood up, brushing dust from my clothes, and decided to search the house more thoroughly. If someone had been trying to open this door, maybe they'd left something behind. Tools, notes, some indication of what they'd been looking for. The hallway closet seemed like a logical place to start. I opened it expecting coats and linens, but instead found it mostly empty, except for some old boxes stacked in the back. As I was pulling them out, my hand brushed against something that didn't belong, a section of the baseboard that moved when I touched it. I pulled harder, and the entire section of wood came away, revealing a hollow space behind it. And inside that space, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, was a book, a diary. I pulled it out carefully, my hands trembling. The plastic crinkled as I unwrapped it, and the book itself was in surprisingly good condition. Leather-bound, with pages that had been carefully preserved from moisture and insects. But when I opened it, I realized immediately that it hadn't been written by Marilyn. The handwriting was different, more careful and deliberate. The first entry was dated 1963, a year after Marilyn's death. This was someone else's diary. Someone who had lived in this house after Marilyn, someone who had discovered things and written them down. I flipped through the pages, scanning entries. Most were mundane, shopping lists, complaints about the weather, reminders about appointments. But then certain phrases began to jump out at me. They came again last night, 3 men in dark suits carrying boxes out to a truck. They said they had permission, but whose permission? I hear noises from beneath the bedroom at night, not mice, something heavier, metal on metal. I found the trap door today. I'm afraid to open it. My hands were shaking so badly now that I could barely hold the book. I kept turning pages until I found what I was looking for, a detailed drawing of the metal door I'd just uncovered. The sketch was remarkably accurate, showing the bolts, the hinges, even the scratch marks around the edges. And beneath the drawing, written in letters that had been pressed so hard into the paper that they'd nearly torn through, was a single sentence. They told her not to open it. She wanted to open it. I stared at those words, reading them over and over. Who was they? Who was she? And then the most terrifying question of all. If Marilyn Monroe had wanted to open that door, what could possibly be down there that was important enough to seal away for decades? I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, searching for any information I could find about the house's history. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. According to public records, Marilyn had never officially lived at this address. Her known residences were well documented, apartments in New York, the house in Brentwood where she died. But this property, it existed in a strange grey area of her biography, mentioned occasionally in passing, but never explored in detail. The house had been purchased in 1960 under a man's name, someone I'd never heard of. Further research revealed he was connected to one of the major Hollywood studios, a name used frequently as a front for property acquisitions that the studios didn't want publicly associated with their corporate entities. Over the next few days, I dove deeper into the dusty boxes I'd found throughout the house. In one, I discovered a collection of old contracts, their pages yellowed and brittle. As I read through them, my unease grew. These weren't normal real estate documents. They contained bizarre clauses, restrictions on who could enter the property after 1960, prohibitions against certain types of renovations, requirements that any new owner sign additional confidentiality agreements. One contract repeatedly mentioned confidential investments, objects of artistic value, and archives of public risk. The language was deliberately vague, clearly designed to obscure rather than clarify. The diary I'd found became my obsession. I read every entry multiple times, looking for patterns, for clues. The woman who'd written it, I never found her name, had lived here in 1963 and 1964. She'd been disturbed by strange occurrences, by men who came and went at odd hours, by sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty house. One entry, dated November 1963, stood out. Found a basement safe today that the realtor swears doesn't exist. But I've seen the blueprints. It's there, and it doesn't belong to the Monroe estate. Someone else put it there, someone who wanted to make sure certain things didn't disappear. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this house wasn't simply a residence. It was a hiding place, a vault, a repository for things that powerful people didn't want found. I decided to talk to the neighbors, the few remaining residents who'd lived in the area long enough to remember the 1960s. Most were reluctant to talk, claiming they didn't remember anything useful, but their eyes told a different story. They remembered, they just didn't want to say. One elderly woman, Mrs. Chen, finally opened up after I'd visited her 3 times. She sat in her living room, hands wrapped around a teacup, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Marilyn wasn't supposed to know about that house," she said. "It was set up by the studio for storage, important things, but somehow she found out about it, started spending time there when she wanted to disappear, and then..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Then what?" I pressed. "Then she started asking questions, looking through things she wasn't supposed to see. They said she was getting paranoid toward the end, but what if she wasn't paranoid? What if she'd actually found something?" The conversation left me chilled. Every piece of evidence I uncovered pointed to the same conclusion. Marilyn had discovered something in this house, something significant enough that powerful people wanted it buried. The question was whether she'd hidden it or whether someone had hidden it from her. I returned to the house that night with a new sense of purpose. The metal door beneath the bedroom floor was no longer just a curiosity. It was the answer to decades of questions that had never been properly asked. I gathered my tools and made my decision. I was going to open that door. Not because I wanted to find treasure or make money from Marilyn's legacy, but because if she had wanted it opened, if she had tried to reveal whatever was down there and been stopped, then someone needed to finish what she'd started. The truth had been buried long enough. As I positioned myself over the metal door, tools in hand, I thought about the diary entry. She wanted to open it. Well, Marilyn, I thought, someone finally will. It took me 2 full days to remove the rusted bolts securing the metal door. They were industrial grade, designed not just to hold, but to discourage, to make anyone who found them give up before they could get inside. I worked with pliers, with WD-40, with a determination fueled by something I couldn't quite name. Grief, maybe, or curiosity, or the sense that I owed something to the woman who'd wanted this opened decades ago. When the final bolt came loose, I gripped the metal handle with both hands and pulled. The sound that erupted was explosive, a crack so loud it seemed to shake the entire house, echoing through empty rooms and down silent hallways. It was the sound of a seal breaking after decades of pressure, of air rushing to equalize, of secrets that had been locked away, finally gasping for breath. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, half expecting alarms to go off or someone to come running. But there was only silence, broken by the faint creak of metal hinges settling into their new position. A smell rose from the opening, old, complex, unmistakable. It was the smell of paper aged to brittleness, of machine oil that had long since separated and dried, of metal slowly oxidizing in darkness. But more than anything, it smelled like time itself, like decades compressed into a single exhalation. I grabbed my flashlight with trembling hands and approached the opening. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the steps made of metal grating that looked sturdy despite its age. I tested the first step carefully, then the second, then committed myself to the descent. The staircase was deliberately claustrophobic, barely wide enough for one person, designed to force you to go single file, to prevent any kind of rushed entry or exit. The walls on either side were concrete, rough and unpainted, industrial in their functionality. As I descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air became denser, heavier with the weight of undisturbed space. My flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing nothing until I reached the bottom. The basement was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, but what struck me immediately was the floor. It wasn't dirt or simple concrete. It was reinforced cement, the kind you'd use for a bank vault or a bomb shelter. This space had been built to last, to protect, to preserve whatever it contained. And in the center of that reinforced floor sat a safe. Not a small personal safe or a wall-mounted lockbox. This was massive, easily the size of an old refrigerator, maybe bigger. It was industrial grey, with a combination lock mechanism on the front that looked complex, even by modern standards. How it had been brought down here, how it had been installed in this underground space, I couldn't imagine. But what made my breath catch, what made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight, was what sat on top of the safe. An envelope, sealed with red wax, and pressed into that wax were two letters. Marilyn Monroe had left something here. Not just used this space, not just known about it. She had deliberately placed this envelope here, had sealed it with her own initials, had left a message for someone to find. I stood frozen, the flashlight beam trembling across the envelope's surface, and felt the full weight of what I'd discovered crash over me. This wasn't just a basement. This wasn't just a hidden room. This was a personal archive, a private vault, something that was never supposed to exist in any official record. I reached out slowly and touched the safe with my fingertips. The metal was cold, solid, utterly uncompromising. Behind this steel door, behind this lock, behind decades of secrecy, was something that had never appeared in any book, any article, any documentary about Marilyn Monroe's life. The official story of her death, her struggles, her relationships, all of it had been written without knowledge of what was locked inside this safe. Everything the world thought it knew about her was incomplete, filtered through the lens of people who'd had reason to keep certain truths hidden. I tried to imagine the logistics of it. Someone, maybe Marilyn herself, maybe someone working on her behalf, had built this underground vault, had installed this massive safe, had filled it with what? Documents? Evidence? Treasures? And then they'd sealed it away, hidden it beneath a house that wasn't officially hers, protected it with industrial locks and deliberate obscurity. This wasn't about preserving memories or saving keepsakes. This was about hiding something, or protecting it, or both. The envelope on top of the safe seemed to pulse in the beam of my flashlight, those two initials staring at me like eyes. MM, a claim of ownership, a signature, a promise that whatever was inside came directly from her, from the woman herself, rather than from the mythology that had consumed her. Whatever was in this safe was valuable enough that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden for over 60 years, valuable enough to bury, to seal, to protect with layers of deception and misdirection. I stood in that underground vault, surrounded by concrete and darkness, and understood with absolute certainty I was standing at the threshold of something that would change everything. The safe had a combination lock, and for a moment I thought I'd come this far only to be stopped by numbers I could never guess. But then I noticed something on the back of the envelope with Marilyn's initials, faint pencil markings, numbers written in the same hand that had sealed the wax. It was as if she'd wanted someone to find this, as if she'd left breadcrumbs for whoever was brave enough or desperate enough to follow them all the way down. My hands shook as I turned the dial, right to 22, left to 36, right to 24, left to 47. The numbers aligned, tumblers clicked into place, and when I pulled the handle, the massive door swung open with a groan that sounded almost like relief. Inside was a collection that would take me weeks to fully understand. Original documents, dozens of them, contracts that had never been filed publicly, agreements signed under duress, non-disclosure agreements that predated her death by years. Letters in her handwriting addressed to people whose names I recognized from history books, politicians, studio executives, men who'd wielded enormous power in the 1960s. There were photographed negatives, carefully preserved in archival sleeves. When I eventually had them developed, they showed moments from Marilyn's life that had never been made public. Candid shots, private moments, images that told stories the official biographies had omitted. Reels of film, some labeled in her handwriting, others with studio markings that had been partially scratched out. Screen tests, rehearsals, footage that had been cut from final releases for reasons that were becoming increasingly clear as I examined everything. Audio recordings on tape that had somehow survived decades in this controlled environment. Her voice, clear and intimate, talking about things she'd never said publicly. Conversations recorded secretly, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as evidence, perhaps simply as truth-telling when no one would listen. Personal writings, journals, letters she'd written but never sent, drafts of a memoir she'd apparently been working on before her death. Page after page in her own hand, telling stories that contradicted the official narrative, revealing relationships and pressures and fears that the world had never been allowed to see. And at the bottom of the safe, in numbered boxes with certificates of authenticity issued before her death, were items that made my hands shake. Original wardrobe pieces from her most famous films, jewelry gifted to her by people whose names alone added zeros to their value, props and memorabilia that collectors had been searching for decades. I couldn't process it all at once. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that basement vault, surrounded by pieces of a woman's life that had been hidden away like contraband, and I cried, not just for her, but for myself. For the way we both had tried to disappear from our pain, only to find that truth has a way of demanding to be acknowledged. Over the following weeks, I brought in appraisers, discreetly, carefully, never revealing the full scope of what I'd found. Each expert examined specific items without knowing the context, without understanding that they were looking at pieces of a larger puzzle. When the evaluations came back, the number was staggering, $310 million. And that was only for what could be officially authenticated and valued. The historical significance, the untold stories, the impact these documents could have on our understanding of Marilyn Monroe and the era she lived in, that was priceless. But as I sat with that number, as I held contracts in my hands that showed just how much control the studios had exerted over her life, how little agency she'd truly had, I understood something profound. Marilyn hadn't been forgotten. She'd been deliberately obscured, her truth buried beneath layers of manufactured mythology, because the real story of exploitation, of power imbalances, of a woman trying desperately to control her own narrative, was too dangerous to tell. She'd hidden these things not to keep secrets, but to preserve truth, to make sure that someday, somehow, someone would find proof that she'd been more than the image they'd created, more than the tragedy they'd written about, more than the cautionary tale they'd reduced her to. I'd bought this house to escape my own grief, to find a place where my husband's absence wouldn't suffocate me. Instead, I'd found the hidden legacy of another woman who'd been suffocating, who'd been desperately trying to breathe, to be seen, to be understood as fully human rather than just an icon. The safe contained $310 million worth of artifacts, but the emotional value, the vindication of a woman who died trying to tell her own story, that couldn't be measured in any currency. I'd opened the right door after all. Not just for myself, but for her. Marilyn Monroe hadn't been forgotten. She'd been waiting for someone to finally listen, to finally look beyond the mythology, to finally acknowledge that behind every legend is a real person who deserves to have their truth told. And now, finally, after 6 decades of silence, her truth could breathe.